The picnic basket was still smoking when I stepped out in my bathrobe and boots, coffee in one hand, tranquilizer gun in the other. A flip-flop was half buried in the moss like a tombstone, and somebody's potato salad had been trampled into a paste so unrecognizable even ants looked confused. Over by the alder trees, a grown man in cargo shorts was climbing higher like his mortgage depended on it. And right in the middle of all that chaos stood Madison CRA, president of the Lakeside Haven HOA, screaming about liability while holding her clipboard like it was a badge of law. You're probably wondering how we got here, why a robe and boots had replaced pants, why a bear named Maple was calmly sniffing the breeze like she'd just wandered into a Sunday farmer's market, and why I was the only one standing between a panicked mob of suburban families and a 600-pound cinnamon grizzly who happened to call my property home. The short version: this land picked me before I even knew I needed it. The long version begins with a man named Uncle Ray. Ray wasn't the kind of uncle who showed up on birthdays with socks or a $20 bill folded into a card. He was part hermit, part scientist, part contradiction wrapped in flannel, a beard like a Christmas wreath, a brain like a field guide, and eyes that seemed to notice details the rest of us tripped over. He believed in the slow work of stewardship. He believed in keeping things wild, feeding them when they needed help, and keeping cars as far away as possible. Before he died, he worked with the state to lock 78 acres of lakefront into a conservation easement so ironclad it could outlast generations. No developments, no shared amenities, no ziplines, no weekend warrior picnic grounds, just water, wind, and everything that belonged to both. When he left it to me, he added a note, for sentences written in handwriting that leaned like tired fence posts. Keep them wild, keep them fed, keep the cars out. I didn't realize until much later that he'd left me a fourth sentence to write. Myself behind the western ridge sat the heart of his promise, a reinforced open-air enclosure with elevated catwalks, brush fencing, and a gate strong enough to stop an ATV inside lived Maple. She wasn't just any bear. She'd been rescued as a cub from a roadside circus, half blind in one eye, imprinted on people enough to be not, and designated under a federal educational permit that in plain English said she lived here, legally, for life. She wasn't a pet, and she wasn't a trophy. She was responsibility incarnate, fur and muscle and breath. My job was simple in the most beautiful way: check the fences, for the salmon, walk the line with a thermos in hand, and file paperwork thick enough to make a lawyer smile. For a while, it was boring in the way only paradise can be. Morning air filled with birdsong, deer tracks pressed into mud like signatures, Maple rolling in sun patches like a dog with a secret. That was my punch clock. And then, across the lake, the HOA arrived. Lakeside Haven looked like a catalog spread dropped on the shoreline. Cedar facades, 3 pre-approved floor plans, streets with names like Spruce Bluff and Maple Shores, even though the real spruce and the real shore existed on my side of the line. At first it was harmless. A kid's fishing bobber floating too close, a couple paddling near enough to spook a heron who lectured them with wings spread wide. I put up the politest signs I could muster. Private conservation zone, no trespassing, live wildlife, thank you kindly. It might have worked if the neighborhood hadn't elected Madison Sierra as president. Madison was the sort of person who prefaced everything with all due respect, and then proceeded to strip every ounce of respect from the room. She was built like a promise she had no intention of keeping, a woman who could weaponize a smile and a clipboard with equal efficiency. The first letter she sent me was typed in a font that tried too hard, asking to discuss shared lakefront amenities for resident families. I mailed back a certified packet thick as a phone book: conservation easement, federal permit, inspection reports, maps with boundary lines, bright as highlighter, and a sticky note that said, "This isn't a golf course, Madison. It's a bear sanctuary." She replied with silence, which would have been fine, except silence is often a setup. A month later, small things started happening. A tree cut clean inside my line, stump still wet, orange survey tape tied around trunks that weren't theirs, a weed-whacked corridor right through a turtle nesting patch Uncle Ray had taught me to read like a diary in sand, and one morning, a laminated sign staked into my soil: future site of HOA trail extension. Enjoy nature responsibly. I pulled it up and drove it straight to their pancake can planning brunch, set it down on her table next to the syrup like a dead fish, and said loud enough for the butter knives to pause, "You push 1 more inch onto my property and I'll feed your surveyor to Maple Met. But the paperwork won't be." Madison didn't flinch. She tapped her clipboard like it was a sheriff's star. "A friend of mine is a property attorney," she said smoothly. "He says you can't own a natural lake." "I don't own the water," I told her. "I own the dirt under it, the shore around it, and the only legal way to reach it. This isn't a public beach. It's a federally protected habitat with a file thick enough to bench press wood. Let the courts decide," she said with the pleasant tone of someone planning to stand on your porch and sell you your own door. I did what Uncle Ray would have done. I tightened the perimeter, solar cameras every 50 yards, fresh signs printed with statute numbers big enough to read through binoculars, a third lock on the western gate, changed weekly. Maple got extra salmon, smoked her favorite cuts, and I started a binder called Madison's Greatest Hits filled with timestamps, GPS pins, and photos of every pink flag I yanked out of my soil. Copies went to the county and the feds with a cover letter that basically said, if a fool wanders into a bear enclosure, I'd like witnesses on paper. Things went quiet long enough for superstition to set in, and that's how you know Act 2 is about to start. It began with a flyer that blew across my truck bed on a Thursday. Join us for the spring renewal picnic at the natural lakeside meadow. Music, food trucks, lawn games, family bonding. There was only one natural lakeside meadow within a mile, and I mowed it with deer, not tractors. I drove the perimeter and found stakes planted 15 feet past my fence, twine stretched across a fox den like they were stringing a wedding arch, and a cheerful sandwich board pointing guests directly toward Maple's Gate as though a Grizzly enclosure was a rustic photo backdrop. I called the sheriff. Deputy Alvarez promised to swing by Monday. I called the state wildlife office. Their guy didn't laugh, which I appreciated. He only said the liability would fall squarely on whoever put a crowd between a bear and her quiet path back. So I hung a vinyl banner across the old trail they kept pretending was public. You are entering a federally permitted live bear habitat. Turn back or leave limbless. I figured fonts would do half the work. The other half arrived Saturday at precisely 11:07 a.m., carried by Bluetooth speakers blasting early 2000s pop songs that made the birds scatter. Picture, a summer camp funded by Denial, folding tables with sunflower tablecloths, a smoker dragged across moss older than state highways, a bounce house groaning against physics, and Madison striding around in a white blazer like a field marshal at a cupcake war. They even strung fairy lights in an ash tree that had survived storms tougher than any HOA regulation. Kids were tossing beans, parents sipped wine tumblers labeled mom fuel, and Maple sat beyond the gate, belly full of fish, sniffing the breeze with the curiosity of a queen watching peasants stumble into her court. I stayed on my porch, filming, sipping coffee, checking my tranquilizer kit. I hoped, foolishly, that they'd pack up before chaos arrived. They lasted 90 minutes, long enough for a kid named Brandon to sail a frisbee over the gate like a bad omen, freeze, then do what kids always do, chase it. 10 seconds later he came sprinting back, mouth open like a siren, yelling one word that stopped every conversation cold. Bear. Panic is a fascinating thing. In the suburbs it looks exactly the same as it does in the wild. Shouting, clattering to dads tripping over the same cooler. A mom shielding a tiny dog like it held nuclear codes. Madison didn't run. She marched straight to the gate like bravery could be notarized. Who is responsible for this? She demanded, voice sharp enough to cut through the noise. That would be me, I said, stepping from the tree line in my bathrobe and boots. Not the authority look I wanted, but the one the day provided. Nobody move. Nobody shout. She's curious, not angry, and I'm going to put her to sleep like a Sunday nap. Maple huffed, sniffed again, and I raised the tranquilizer rifle. One dart, soft hiss, a grunt, and she sat down like a tired uncle after Thanksgiving. Within minutes, her head lulled. 10 more, and she was snoring. The crowd exhaled in ragged unison. 20 minutes later, the state officer rolled up, clipboard.com, signed the log, and helped me guide Maple back behind the gate. Madison, mascara streaked and blouse stained with wine, stepped toward me like a ghost refusing to accept its condition. You staged this, she spat. You planted that animal here to threaten families. You threw a party in a bear preserve, I said. The only thing I planted was a banner that told you not to. 72 hours later, the envelope landed in my mailbox like a warning shot. Faux gold seal on the flap, bold letters across the front. Civil nuisance complaint. Inside, Madison's board had crafted their masterpiece of fear. According to them, Maple wasn't a federally permitted rescue animal. She was an apex predator maintained to intimidate. The packet included 3 blurry photos, Maple sniffing the air, me with a tranquilizer rifle looking like I was drinking a breakfast beer, and the bounce house mid-deflation as if sagging vinyl was proof of savagery. Fear travels faster than truth because it doesn't need legs. It rides in whispers, in Facebook posts, in the way a mother looks at her dog refusing dinner and convinces herself it's trauma instead of indigestion. Madison knew this. She weaponized it. Flyers appeared on community mailboxes about unregulated predators. A neighborhood Facebook thread warned that her golden retriever had lost his appetite after hearing Maple snore across the water. And as a final touch, the HOA installed a row of solar-powered ultrasonic sirens that screeched every time a squirrel voiced an opinion, wrecking the nesting cycle of the herons I'd guarded for 6 years. I answered their complaint. The only way you can when someone throws paper at you, with heavier paper, conservation easement documents, state permits, federal registration numbers, letters from the university's ecology department and the non-profit I partnered with for habitat surveys, inspection logs with signatures, incident reports with times, security footage showing exactly where their picnic had crossed my line, how many warnings they had ignored, which board members had hammered stakes into protected ground. My reply packet was thick enough to sprain a wrist, but facts don't always quiet noise. Madison doubled down. She had the smirk of someone who believed community outrage was stronger than regulations, that a clipboard could outweigh a permit if waved high enough. And maybe she would have been right if I hadn't decided to go public. That's when I called Dr. Leah Chan, a state biologist with a voice like gravel and zero tolerance for nonsense. She'd spent her career collaring elk, tagging birds, and testifying at hearings where men twice her size tried to talk over her. She didn't just know her field, she enforced it. When I explained the situation, she said one sentence that made me breathe easier for the first time in weeks. Let's show them what stewardship actually looks like. Then I called Jonah Pike, independent reporter, YouTube channel with more reach than any HOA newsletter. He had the kind of reputation that comes from being sued twice and winning both cases because receipts don't lie. Jonah lived for stories where paper authority clashed with lived truth. You've got a federally protected bear and a power-hungry HOA president, he said over the phone. I'll bring 2 cameras and a drone. We walked the property together on a gray morning that smelled like pine and rain. Jonah filmed the fences, the signs, the permit numbers. Dr. Chan pointed out vegetation I'd been protecting for years, explained nesting cycles, the fox den Madison's people had trampled. We traced the path of their picnic like detectives, every footprint a reminder of arrogance. And right on cue, Maple lumbered out of her enclosure, flopped in a patch of sunlight, and rolled onto her back like she was auditioning for a dog park. Jonah's camera caught it all. The video went live 2 days later with the title, The Bear Next Door, When Suburbia Meets a Sanctuary. At first it went mildly viral, shares among local environmental groups, a couple hundred comments, curious viewers. Then it went wildly viral. NPR picked it up, a wildlife vet retweeted it, someone clipped Maple sneezing into a 10-second loop, and the internet did what it always does when it finds something pure. It turned her into a folk hero in less than 12 hours. Public sympathy is a funny mirror. It forces people to see themselves in situations they'd rather ignore. Madison's neighbors started asking questions. Why were there dues funding lawsuits? Why was the board picking a fight with a federally permitted animal? Why were banners being stapled to trees they didn't own? Fear curdled into doubt, and doubt into anger. That's when Madison made her boldest move. She circulated a petition, digital of course, because signatures are easier to fake when they live on a screen. It demanded the reassignment of underutilized private land for essential community recreation. Translation: eminent domain, HOA style. The signatures numbered 33 belonged to residents who had been dead for years. 5 belonged to families who'd moved to Boise. Handful was signed by M. Crowell. In handwriting suspiciously identical, I bundled the petition with every scrap of evidence I had and sent it to the state attorney and the Department of Natural Resources. 2 weeks later, the calls came in. Investigations were opening. Madison's vice president resigned before his name could be printed in the paper, and a conservation official asked me if I'd like to upgrade my property's status from habitat to critical habitat. If you've never heard a bureaucrat use the word permanent, let me tell you it's surprisingly musical. But before permanence came judgment. The county scheduled a hearing, 9 a.m. admin building, panel of 3, a zoning council member, a wildlife officer, and in the center Judge Carmen wrote. She had the posture of a lighthouse and the reputation of someone who once sentenced a man to community service for butchering his neighbor's hedge. The day of the hearing, the room smelled of copier ink and nerves. Madison went first. She strode to the front with a leather-bound presentation titled When Nature Becomes a Menace. Her slideshow featured stock photos of bear maulings, her voice rising each time she said the word predator. She tossed in jargon like pheromone drift as if she'd invented it. When she sat down, she looked like she'd just scored points in a debate round. Then it was my turn. Judge Rhodes fixed her gaze on me. Mr. Hartley, she said. I walked up with a binder so heavy the table groaned. If it pleases the panel, I said, clicking the remote, a timeline. The projector filled with drone footage, not gore, not panic, just facts. The HOA picnic crossing the line, stakes hammered into a fox den, a bounce house sagging on an endangered moss bed, close-ups of signs they'd walked past, then the map showing my protected perimeter, then the federal permit, then letters from 3 biologists calling this place a model sanctuary. Finally, because even justice deserves a reveal, I pulled up a spreadsheet, line after line of expenditures. $18,427 of HOA emergency landscaping funds redirected to party rentals, generators, decor, and yes, a $400 invoice labeled bareface painting. The silence after that could have been bottled. Someone coughed just to prove they were still alive. Judge Rhodes leaned forward, voice like a gavel before it struck. Miss Sura, did you personally approve these expenditures? Madison adjusted her necklace, throat dry. As acting president, yes or no? Yes. The gavel fell. Heavy final petition denied. Land remains private, conserved under state and federal jurisdiction. Immediate cease and desist within 100 yards of the boundary. Public retraction of false safety claims. Full reimbursement to the emergency fund, including the judge's eyes didn't flinch, the face painting from the back row. Her husband Brent made a sound like a tire losing air. I closed my binder and felt something shift. Not triumph exactly, but a settling, like when you finally fix the joist on a porch that's been groaning for years. The fallout was swift. Within a week, the community called a special meeting. A no-confidence vote swept Madison out of office. The treasurer followed. The board suddenly discovered an interest in wetlands regulations, and for the first time since they'd arrived, Lakeside Haven stopped looking like a threat and started looking like neighbors. The new president, Noah Green, was a soft-spoken man who actually knew what a riparian buffer was. He invited me to coffee and asked if I'd lead a Saturday nature walk for the neighborhood kids. I told him yes, on one condition. "What's that?" he asked. "Rename the newsletter." "To what?" "The Bare Facts," he laughed. And the first issue featured Maple snoring on page 1 like a queen who had survived the storm. The weeks after Madison's downfall felt strange, like watching a storm drain back into the clouds. For the first time in months, the air around the lake carried laughter instead of tension. The hammering of survey stakes was replaced by the sound of children skipping rocks. I walked the perimeter with my thermos and my checklist, but I no longer did it with a knot in my stomach. The fences stood tall, the locks turned smooth, and the cameras blinked quietly without catching pink flags or laminated lies. Maple, of course, noticed none of this. She lived in her world of salmon, sun patches, and the occasional roll in the dirt, like a diva in fur. The internet still adored her. Jonah Pike's video had grown from viral clip to cultural touchstone. Someone printed Maple's sneeze on t-shirts. A brewery released a seasonal ale called Cinnamon Sanctuary, and the local school kids had a new mascot, but louder than any vote Maple to bear. One evening I sat on the dock with a cup of coffee, watching the herons glide low over the water, and realized something important. Madison hadn't been defeated by me alone. She'd been defeated by the truth, by the weight of paperwork, by the patience of wildlife. By the way, a bear doing nothing but yawning can remind people what humility looks like. The new HOA president, Noah Green, kept his promise. The newsletter was rechristened The Bare Facts. The first issue featured a front-page photo of Maple snoring in her enclosure, captioned, "Our real president elected unanimously." It was meant as a joke, but it carried a truth sharper than satire. For once, the board wasn't trying to own the lake, but to understand it. Noah invited me to lead that Saturday nature walk. I agreed, half expecting a handful of kids with half-broken binoculars. Instead, 24 families showed up. Parents, grandparents, kids tugging on sleeves, all curious, all willing to listen. We walked the paths slowly, stopping at fox dens, turtle nesting patches, and heron rookeries. Dr. Chan joined us, explaining migration cycles in the plainest, most beautiful words I'd ever heard. The kids asked more questions than the adults, which gave me hope. And Maple, in her usual way, stole the show by appearing just long enough to flop in the grass and roll like a dog, making every phone camera flash at once. After that day, something shifted. Lakeside Haven stopped treating my land as a threat and started treating it like a neighbor's gift. Families organized cleanup days on their side of the shoreline. Kids painted signs reminding each other to keep boats away from nesting areas. And one afternoon, Noah handed me a proposal not for annexation, not for shared amenities, but for cooperation, a small community fund to help with habitat restoration, overseen not by the HOA but by the State Wildlife Office. For the first time, the phrase "working together" didn't feel like a trap. Madison, meanwhile, vanished from the landscape. Word was she'd sold her house and moved to towns over, though rumors said she was already trying to run another HOA into the ground. Some people never learn. Her husband Brent kept a low profile, his name forever tied to invoices for bounce houses and bare face painting, but her shadow lingered. At night, when the wind pressed against the windows, I'd think about her insistence, that obsession with control, clipboard in hand. She believed that authority could be manufactured, that law was nothing more than confidence printed in bold. She forgot the most important thing Uncle Ray had ever taught me. Authority without humility is just noise. Ray's note still hung above my desk, coffee stained and curling at the edges. Keep them wild, keep them fed, keep the cars out. I had added a fourth line in pencil, one Madison had forced me to write. Keep the clipboards honest. Maple didn't know she was a folk hero. She didn't know she'd become a meme or that strangers across the country wore her sneeze on their chests. All she knew was salmon in the morning, sun in the afternoon, and the steady heartbeat of land that belonged to itself. She reminded me daily that stewardship wasn't about applause or headlines. It was about quiet consistency, about walking the line even when no one watched, about understanding that boundaries weren't barriers, they were lessons. Boundaries teach. They teach people that some spaces are not theirs to claim, no matter how many signatures they gather or how many clipboards they wave. They teach that nature doesn't ask permission to exist, and that community isn't a word you can twist into a key for someone else's door. The observation deck came next. It started as a GoFundMe launched by neighbors who had once accused me of harboring predators. Within a week, the goal was met. Within a month, The deck was built a simple wooden platform overlooking the meadow near Maple's enclosure. Kids leaned over its railings to watch her from a safe distance. Teachers scheduled field trips. Tourists passed through and left notes in a weatherproof box nailed to the post. Some notes were silly drawings of bears with crowns. Others were heartfelt thank yous from people who'd never before seen a wild creature so close yet so respected. I carved a cedar sign and set it by the dock where the bounce house had once sagged into moss. It read, "Private property, home of Maple, HOA's real president." And for once, there were no arguments, no petitions, no complaints, just quiet nods and the occasional chuckle from a passing neighbor who finally understood that some presidencies can't be voted out. It's funny how quickly memory edits itself. The chaos of that picnic, the shouting, the fear, it all blurred into a story people retold with laughter now. Parents would joke about the day their kids saw a real bear. Kids bragged about how they survived Maple. Madison's clipboard became a punchline. What stuck wasn't fear but humility for me. The real lesson came late one night when I found myself replaying Jonah's video. The drone footage, the signs, the footage of Maple rolling in the grass. I scrolled through the comments, thousands of them. Some were jokes. Some were angry at HOAs in general. But a few stood out. This story reminded me that not everything needs to be owned. My HOA tried something similar. Thank you for standing your ground. My kid wants to be a biologist now because of Maple. That's when I understood the full weight of what Uncle Ray had left me. It wasn't just land. It wasn't just a bear. It was a story. A living story about boundaries, humility, and what happens when control collides with truth. If you'd asked me then whether I'd go through it all again, the paperwork, the hearings, the panic, the viral storm, I would have said yes. Because the truth doesn't always roar. Sometimes it yawns, lies down in the sun, and lets the world adjust its perspective. That's the real ending Madison never saw coming. Not the gavel, not the resignation, but the transformation of an HOA into a community, of a bear into a symbol, and of a man in a bathrobe with a tranquilizer gun into someone who finally understood what stewardship meant. And as the herons returned to their nests, the foxes reclaimed their den, and Maple snored like royalty in her enclosure, I realized something else. Sometimes the wild doesn't just need to be kept, sometimes it keeps you. The lake was quiet the morning after the newsletter went out, with Maple snoring on the cover. Sunlight cut clean lines across the water, the kind of golden hour Uncle Ray used to call truth light. For the first time in months, my coffee tasted like coffee instead of adrenaline. I sat on the porch with Maple's enclosure in view, the cedar sign at the dock catching the dawn. And I thought, maybe the storm had finally broken. But storms don't just disappear. They leave debris behind, sometimes invisible, sometimes buried deep. And in Lakeside Haven, the debris looked like second thoughts. Neighbors who had once applauded Madison's crusade now avoided her name like it was bad luck. Parents who had screamed at me during the picnic approached with awkward apologies. Some bringing casseroles, others offering to volunteer for habitat cleanups. It was strange, seeing suspicion turn to goodwill. Suspicion has sharp edges. Goodwill feels clumsy at first, like neighbors trying on clothes that don't quite fit. Noah Green was the bridge, soft-spoken, steady, never with a clipboard, always with a notebook. He asked questions instead of giving orders. He admitted what he didn't know. He wasn't trying to tame the wild. He was trying to understand it. And in that shift I realized something. Maybe the fight hadn't been about Maple at all. Maybe it had always been about what kind of authority people believed in. Madison believed in paper and fear. Noah believed in humility and learning. One of them lost because the wild doesn't bend to clipboards. The observation deck filled quickly with kids on weekends. Some drew sketches of birds. Some whispered like they were in a church. Maple became more than a meme. She became a teacher. She'd lumber out, flop in the grass, and roll. And in that moment, every child understood something no textbook could teach. Wild doesn't need to be feared if it's respected. Dr. Chan returned often, leading biology workshops. She brought microscopes, let kids study moss and feathers, explained food chains in ways that made even tired parents lean in. She reminded everyone that stewardship wasn't boring paperwork, it was living proof of balance. I could see the spark in some of those kids' eyes. Maybe one day they'd carry clipboards of their own, but not the kind Madison weaponized, the kind that measured nests and counted fish and proved life could thrive alongside us. Jonah Pike's video kept climbing in views. At first it was wildlife enthusiasts, then HOA survivors, then mainstream news. NPR invited me to talk about Maple. A local morning show called her America's favorite bear. Someone edited together clips of her yawning with dramatic orchestra music. The world had chosen its folk hero, and she was too busy licking salmon off her paws to notice. But fame comes with shadows. A week after the video hit 1 million views, I got a letter from a lawyer representing a theme park 3 states over. They wanted Maple transferred, citing educational display opportunities. I didn't even bother calling back. Federal permit law was on my side, but it made me realize just how fragile protection can feel when money sees an opening. I doubled the locks again, installed new motion lights, not out of fear of maple, but of people who couldn't understand that some creatures aren't exhibits. Their stories written in fur and claw. One night, scrolling through comments on Jonah's channel, I found one that froze me. My HOA tore down my butterfly garden because it didn't match aesthetics. Thank you for showing that not all rules are worth obeying. Another read. This story made me fight back. They said I couldn't hang a bird feeder. I sent them your video and dared them to find me. I hadn't meant to start a movement, but in a way, Madison had. Her obsession with control had exposed something bigger. How fragile people feel when neighbors with clipboards decide to play gods of tiny kingdoms. Maple wasn't just a bear anymore. She was proof that truth doesn't bend, that nature doesn't need permission slips, that wildness has its own quiet authority. The county sent a follow-up notice. My property was now officially designated critical habitat, permanent, immutable. Even if I wanted to sell, even if someone offered millions, the land would remain protected. I taped that letter next to Uncle Ray's note. Together, they looked like scripture. That summer, a storm rolled through, not political this time, but natural. Winds tore across the lake, snapping branches, ripping shingles. Lakeside Haven lost power for 3 days, but when the sun came back, the observation deck still stood. Maple's enclosure held strong, and for the first time, neighbors from across the water brought their kids to my porch not to complain, not to trespass, but to share food, charge phones, and sit quietly while Maple snored in the background. Funny, Noah said, sipping coffee beside me as kids played cards on the porch floor. The thing Madison said was a menace turned out to be the calmest part of this storm. He was right. Maple didn't care about winds or wires. She cared about salmon, naps, and sun. She didn't panic. She simply existed. And in her existence, she reminded people what survival actually looks like. Weeks later, I stood at the county fair where the local school had set up a booth with a giant cardboard cutout of Maple kids lined up to pose with her. Someone sold maple-shaped cookies. A biology teacher handed out pamphlets on conservation, smiling as she told me applications for her science club had doubled. All because one bear sneezed on camera, and in that moment, surrounded by laughter and the scent of kettle corn, I understood Uncle Ray's legacy more deeply than ever. He hadn't just left me land, he'd left me a stage where truth could play itself out without needing applause, where wildness could remind people they weren't in charge of everything, no matter how many rules they wrote. Madison had once said she'd let the courts decide, but the courts were only one part of the verdict. The real decision was made by every kid who drew maple in crayon, every neighbor who stopped stapling signs to trees, every stranger online who shared Jonah's video with the caption, "This is how you protect what matters." I thought back to that morning when I'd stepped out in a robe and boots, tranquilizer rifle in hand, coffee steaming, chaos all around. Back then it had felt like the hardest day of my life. Now it felt like the hinge of everything. The moment fear tried to plant itself and truth said no. Uncle Ray's words still hung above my desk. Keep them wild, keep them fed, keep the cars out. I'd added my own line, keep the clipboards honest. But maybe there was a fifth now. One Maple had written in her own way. Keep the wild close enough to remind you what matters, because that's the thing. Boundaries aren't about pushing people out. They're about teaching people how to come close without destroying what they touch. The last real test came on a Tuesday that pretended to be ordinary. Low clouds, a wind that ruffled the lake into coins, the smell of wet cedar. I was mid-round with my thermos, checking the western fence, when I heard voices where there shouldn't be any. Not panicked voices, confident ones, the kind people use when they've already decided they belong. 2 men in crisp polo shirts and camera harnesses stepped out from the tree line like they were on a guided tour. Behind them, a third man in a branded jacket dragged a plastic case through ferns. Their boots were too clean. Their smiles were too sure. The tallest one lifted a hand like we'd scheduled this morning. "We're with Great American Wild," he said, pointing his thumb back at the case. "We've got a remote camera rig and a producer on standby. Heard about Maple's story. Thought we'd capture a few human interest shots. Quick shoot, low impact, big exposure. Everyone wins. Everyone never wins when the pitch starts, with everyone wins." "This is critical habitat," I said, nodding at the posted sign they'd walked past. "No filming without state authorization. No access without my written consent." "That's the thing," the second guy said, palming a laminate badge that looked impressive on the lanyard. "We've got soft approval from a regional partner." He said the word partner like a password. I asked for a name. He gave me a string of syllables that sounded real enough to pass a casual test and fake enough to fail any real one. I radioed Dr. Chan. She picked up on the second ring and said, with the soft mercy of someone who has done this 100 times. Put them on speaker. They started strong educational value, public awareness, the good of conservation. She'll let them talk themselves into the corner. Then asked for their permit number. Silence. She asked for the letter of authorization. Silence. She asked which part of critical they thought meant content. One of them tried to laugh. It came out like a cough. "Gentlemen," she said, "you're 70 feet inside a restricted zone. The only shot you'll capture today is the one where you walk back to your car and reconsider the word understory. They left with more apologies than they'd arrived with. I watched their backs recede down the path, plastic case bumping against roots, and felt a familiar heat fade from my shoulders. It was small as tests go, but it was the perfect size for the new life we were building, the kind you pass not with anger but with a phone call and a sign that never lies. By August, the observation deck had a book of messages thick as a hymn. Field trips wrote thank yous in shaky pencil. A veteran drew a careful sketch of Maple asleep, adding a note served to tours. This is the most peace I've felt in 5 years. A woman taped in a printout of a Facebook memory of the picnicker kid running the bounce house behind him like a sleepy Wayland wrote, "I'm sorry, I didn't understand." On a cool evening toward summer's end, Noah invited the neighborhood to the deck for a dusk watch. No loudspeakers, no food trucks, just folding stools and quiet. Parents whispered, kids pointed and hushed each other like librarians. The lake wore the last light like a shawl. Then Maple arrived, not with fanfare but with inevitability. Shouldering through brush with the grace of something that has never once asked permission to exist, she crossed to her favorite patch of grass, turned twice, and lay down with the contented old king sigh that always made me smile. Somewhere behind me, a parent sniffed back a laugh. Someone else sniffed back a tear. A girl near the rail breathed. She looks like a mountain that learned how to nap. After dark, when the deck had emptied and crickets tuned up, Noah stayed behind. He leaned on the rail and watched the shape of Maple against the shape of Earth. "I used to love rules," he said without looking at me. "They kept life from spilling. Then Madison taught me rules can spill too if you pour them on the wrong place." He paused. "Thank you for not giving up on us." I didn't have a speech handy. I never do when the moment deserves one. I just told him the truth. That Uncle Ray taught me the only rules worth keeping are the ones you can explain to a child, without lying. If this were a different story, maybe the next chapter would be a bigger storm, a bigger court, a bigger villain. But that's not how most lives go, no matter how many thumbnails promise it. Most lives bend on 100 small hinges. A principal who approves a field trip instead of canceling it. A treasurer who balances a budget without siphoning it. A neighbor who pulls a sign out of the ground and decides not to put it back. A biologist who answers her phone. A reporter who uploads a video. A judge who says a simple word like permanent and means it. The big villain left, but echoes lingered in little places. A new family moved into Madison's old house. They placed a patio set too close to a swale, then moved it when Noah explained why that mattered. A teen cut across the old path on a dare and got an earful from his grandmother before I could say a word. A realtor tried to advertise lakeside access and was gently corrected by 10 comments before breakfast. Systems fail and systems learn. Lakeside Haven learned, not all at once, not perfectly, but real. One afternoon, as a thin rain stitched the lake to the sky, I found a letter wedged under the office door. No return address, no name, just blocky handwriting that carried more humility than style. "I fought you online last year. I said mean things I can't take back. I've been angry at everything for a long time, and you were convenient. I walked the new trail with my daughter last weekend. We watched your bear nap. She asked me who protects her when she sleeps. I told her you do. I want to protect something like that too. I'm sorry." A neighbor I slid the letter into the plastic sleeve beside Uncle Ray's note. "On good days I think those two belong together, one the mission, the other the proof that missions can matter. On hard days, I reread them both. Then I make coffee and walk the fence anyway." Maple, for her part, fulfilled every contract she never signed. She grew slower. She learned the sun's schedule better than any clock. Some mornings she greeted me with a huff I pretended was hello. Some evenings she ignored me with the grace only the self-possessed can manage. She bloomed into the kind of old age that makes the word elder feel small. We replaced a section of railing with thicker posts because wheelchair groups had started visiting and I wanted them to lean without worry. We installed a second binocular stand at kid height. We added a hand-painted sign that read, "Look with respect." The kids obeyed. The adults tried. One day in late September, Jonah came back with a smaller camera and a bigger grin. "No drone," he said, waving his empty hands. "Just faces." He'd been filming a follow-up, not about bears, but about communities that learned. He shot Noah listening more than talking, Dr. Chan teaching more than scolding, a circle of kids around a leaf like it was a jewel. He asked me one question on camera and it was the only one that mattered. "What did you learn?" I could have said 1,000 things. I could have recited statutes or dates or dollar amounts. But what I said surprised even me. "I learned that quiet is stronger than noise," I told him. "That a yawn can beat a shout. That a boundary explained is a boundary respected. That authority needs to kneel before it stands. That a clipboard isn't a crown. And that the wild will outlast our worst ideas if we give it the room." He used 10 seconds of that in the final cut. 10 was enough. In October, the county hosted a small ceremony on the deck. Nothing grand. A certificate in a cheap frame. A few words from a council member who pronounced riparian correctly on the second try. They gave me a plaque I didn't need and shook my hand while Maple snored through the whole thing like a heckler with manners. When they asked if I wanted to say anything, I read Uncle Ray's note, all 4 lines, then added the 5th I'd written myself. A few people cried. A few smiled. Most just looked at Maple and understood. Every story ends. The good ones turn into other stories. The bad ones end twice because people pretend the first ending didn't count. Mine ends like this. I still wake up early. I still walk the fence with a thermos. I still check the locks, the cameras, the catwalk bolts. I still log salmon weights, even when it's cold enough to make pen ink sulk. I still catch my breath when Maple rolls into sunlight and turns the ground into a throne. The herons returned, the foxes raised kits, the turtles scribbled their yearly notes in sand and let me read them like a diary. And across the water, people kept learning. You can hear learning if you listen. It sounds like voices that fall to a hush without being told. Sometimes a car slows on the county road and a stranger leans out to ask if this is the place with the famous bear. I tell them she's not famous here, she's just Maple. That's enough. Then I point them to the deck and the binoculars and the sign that says look with respect, and I hope they do. If you came all this way to hear about a gavel, here, Judge Rhodes is retired 6 months later. She bought a kayak. I like to think she took it someplace quiet and learned the names of birds she used to read about in filings. If you came for an arrest, there wasn't one. There was something better, a resignation, a vote, an apology no one can force. If you came for vengeance, I can't help you. The wild doesn't do vengeance. It does gravity. Paper falls where it should. Water finds its level. Truth sits heavy and waits you out. People keep asking me a version of the same question. Was Madison protecting her neighbors, or was she trying to turn the wild into a photo op and call it safety? The real answer is boring and useful. She was protecting an idea of control that had never met a living thing. She forgot that community is not a tool for taking, it's a promise for tending. She forgot that you don't safety your way into someone else's land with a font and a smile. And she forgot that sometimes the president of a place isn't a person. It's a bear who sleeps like a sermon. So tell me where you land. Maybe you live under an HOA. Maybe you serve on a board. Maybe you've stapled a sign to a tree and called it stewardship. Maybe you've pulled one out of the ground and called it rebellion. I want your line in this story. I want to know where you draw boundaries and why. Do you think a community's right to enjoy nature extends onto land that exists precisely because it's not a park? Does safety mean fences? Or does it mean teaching people to see the fence and choose to turn back? Drop your take in the comments. Argue it out. Teach each other something. Tell me where you're watching from. And tell me where the wild still wins where you live. If Maple earned a seat at your table today, if she taught you anything by doing nothing more than being exactly what she is, share this with someone who thinks a fence is an invitation. Uncle Ray's note is still taped over my desk, coffee stained and curling at the edges. Keep them wild, keep them fed, keep the cars out, keep the clipboards honest. And one more I write under my breath when no one's listening. Keep your heart just close enough to the wild that it can change it. Because that's the secret no one taught. Madison and everyone else eventually learns. The wild doesn't belong to us. We belong to it long enough to remember how to belong to each other. And if a bathrobe, a thermos, a tranquilizer gun, and a bear named Maple can make that point with fewer words than a lawsuit, then I'll keep walking the fence at dawn and let her do the heavy lifting.